All right. Well, I'm Brian Carey. First of all, to introduce myself, I am the international director of Peacebuilding. So Peter Digital Anderson is the executive director of Peace Catalyst in the United States. I do a lot more of the networking work, some of the training and formation work for our international team members, as well as living and working in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share a couple slides. I'll be popping into slides and out of slides at various points in the meeting just for a few visuals and conversation points. And then I hope I can keep things brief enough to have a little bit of interaction for those that have questions, insights, other points to bear on the theme. So all of you signed up, so you're very well aware that today we're talking about the fun topic of sin, healing, and the peace of God. So, first of all, before we get into that theme, I want to introduce Peace Catalyst just very briefly for those who don't know. But we are a global network of Christian peace builders. There's actually a couple others. Another new team member just joined in Nigeria, so it's kind of over, the ocean kind of nestled in there by Africa, just above there, in Abuja, Nigeria. And we have different people kind of in process. We're building this network of partner organizations as well, and excited to basically mainstream peace building as at the center of Christian understanding of vocation and mission. So we're a growing movement of peace in the church and beyond, also working with partners from other backgrounds. And we are a community following Jesus' way of peace together. And so oftentimes working together, both providing mutual support, mutual learning, kind of iron sharpening iron dynamics, both in terms of theological questions and challenges, in terms of practical skills with peace building, creative interventions in different conflict areas, post-conflict areas, polarized societies around the world. So we dream of a world where neighbors know each other, care for each other, where everyone can flourish. And as followers of Jesus, we believe the church is called to work with their communities to make this flourishing a reality. We also know that Christians oftentimes are failing in this. And so Peace Catalyst exists to equip and mobilize Christians as peace builders in partnership with everyone in our communities around us to work together, collaborate together across divisions, and partner for the common good. So today, we are talking about sin. And that phrase alone, so I'm interested to see already all the people that have joined, and I think there may be a variety of reasons for that. But thinking about sin and peace building, I found that so many different theological questions sit in some sort of tension with peace building. People are like, well, how does this key theological paradigm connect with peace building? So this is one of the many theological themes that I've been really interested to see how can we articulate more clearly how so much, I would say all of our theology connects deeply with this vision of shalom, this biblical vision that God has for the world of holistic and flourishing peace. And how is all of our theology actually in some way reinforcing and animating us to follow Jesus in the work of peace building? So, but sin itself can stir an incredible amount of discomfort. For many of us, sin talk conjures all sorts of memories of shame, judgment, being made to feel small. It's often used like a hammer, especially against people already struggling with self-doubt, self-loathing, trauma. It's been wielded in ways that compound harm sometimes rather than work to heal it. But we also, I think in the world today, especially with all the wars going on, all the polarization, there's this paradox. We realize sin is very real and it's causing deep damage to individuals, relationships, communities, entire societies. And the Christian tradition has this really rich, life-giving vision of naming and healing sin that goes beyond just guilt management or moral scorekeeping. And so I think a lot of us would be familiar that scripture uses many different metaphors for sin. It's described as missing the mark, breaking trust, like betraying the covenant, moral distortion or twisting what's good, debt stain, slavery, unfaithfulness, exile, disease. And so these metaphors reflect that sin isn't just something we do, it's also something that we suffer, something we're caught in, something that's infecting all of the systems that are parts of our life, the stories that we're part of from as part of different groups, whatever ethnic background, of course, different religious backgrounds as well. Sin is also something we participate in. And so I'm finding with so many of these different theological themes, it feels like there are ways to understand a theological theme that in some way reinforce a status quo understanding of faith and conflict and polarization and who we are and the other and the enemy. And it's kind of like a status quo kind of cultural faith. And sin, of course, there's many, I think, ways that people understand sin that actually kind of lock in escapist kind of understandings of the gospel, moral scorekeeping. I think, as Dallas Willard put it, the gospel of sin management. So in many ways, Christians understand sin in that way. I think there are other ways that sin can be understood that are, in my view, much more faithful, that open our eyes to so many of the bigger issues at play that are real in our relationships, in our lives, in our societies, and that really animate us, compel us to join in Jesus's work of peace building. So there's this ambiguity, like so many theological themes, they're not neutral. Different ways of understanding different theological themes seem to animate different responses about how we follow Jesus. And so that's what I'm interested in today to explore with you all. And I think an important point for me is that some of these ideas that we're going to be discussing today, a lot of them have developed out of peace building workshops. And then over time, different participants, so like yourselves today, have been like, oh my gosh, like this isn't just true about this. This connects to how we understand sin. And so there's been this interactive dynamic in different peace building workshops that have that have shifted, spun kind of the gems. So we see kind of how this theological theme connects to our everyday lives in a different way. So tonight, we're wanting to explore this kind of reframe of sin, of how is sin connected to peace building, that it's not just this bludgeon, but it's a reality in our lives that's destroying our societies, just destroying our relationships, our personal lives, a reality to be healed from, unlearned, a reality to kind of be disempowered or combated in some kind of way, and not just for individuals, but for the sake of our societies, for the sake of God's vision of shalom. So we're going to explore three lenses over the next hour and 15 minutes. I hope that at least one or two of these will be a slightly different angle to start to think about sin than maybe you've experienced before. And I hope there's mention of different resources for you to go deeper. There's also ways, because this is an interaction, my hope is that we're learning to articulate better paradigms for Christians, for Christianity, because in many ways it seems our paradigms for how we approach our faith have not really animated many Christians to join in this beautiful vision of shalom, this work of peace building that God invites us to. So how can our understanding of sin, our paradigms for it, animate us more in that direction? And that's my hope and my goal. So to introduce these three paradigms, and then I'll get into one by one, and we'll have a bit of interaction about each. The first is this idea of a sin triangle. And this is building on the work of Johann Galtung and his violence triangle. And we'll explore how sin shows up both in direct sin, as well as structural sin and cultural sin, and how all three feed into each other. The second paradigm we'll explore is a sin cycle. And this is based on workshops that I've done related to cycles of harm and violence. Some of you, if you're aware of the work of Eastern Mennonite University and the STAR program, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, they have this diagram, which I'll share a link to later, and we'll look at later, of this kind of spiral of how we experience trauma or hurt or harm, and it creates all sorts of internal processes of self-harm, of self-doubt, of anger, strong emotions. But this also can launch us onto a journey of doing harm, to protect ourselves, to lash out against others. And so as I did workshops related to cycles of harm and violence, different participants were like, this is a better picture of sin than I've ever seen. And I'm like, oh, we should think about this as a paradigm for sin, in terms of how there's these cycles of sin that feed one another. And then the third paradigm. So first is a sin triangle, the second is a sin cycle, and then the third is a sin, death, powers matrix. And this is building on the work of Richard Beck. He wrote a book called The Slavery of Death. So another resource I hope you can look at. And he basically explores this inversion of the traditional Western Protestant paradigm of sin as the primary problem, where we see the wages of sin as death. And he looks at Orthodox theology and different church fathers and ways of understanding sin, where actually they view it inverted, where there's ancestral sin, in which sin, Adam and Eve, created the context of death in which we find ourselves, and yet death now motivates, drives, animates sin because of our fear of death. And there's so much biblical language about that as well. So these are the three paradigms we're going to explore. And so each of these frameworks, for me, the goal is not just to bring clarity about like what's wrong about sin itself, but if our understanding of sin shifts to become more holistic, to see a clearer picture of why is society so broken, then we're not only understanding the problem differently, our understanding of sin differently animates our participation in a different response to participate in God's liberating, healing mission of peace building, of shalom building, eirene building in a different way. So then we can follow how Jesus is confronting sin, not just in hearts, but in systems, in societies, in cycles, in the fear that oftentimes animates all of this. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll dive into the first. All right. So I'm not sure how many of you would be familiar with Johann Galtung's violence triangle, but I would encourage you to look it up. In a few minutes or after this, we can share the link as well to this video as one of many, but you can also look up Galtung violence triangle and you'll find it. But more or less what Galtung discusses is that he has this framework, which has been used in peace building for decades now, that if we only understand what is more visible, direct violence, then we are going to be poor peace builders indeed. That there are larger patterns and systems at play as relates to violence. So in this video that I just referenced, it shares the example of post-election violence in Kenya a number of years ago. And he discusses how there's actually structural violence behind the scenes of denying voting rights to certain groups who feel misrepresented, underrepresented in society, that then drives different protests, different riots, different responses related to post-election violence. And we see many examples of this. So there's a difference here where all of a sudden structural violence can be much less visible because the victims may be clear enough, especially when you start to hear their stories, but it's much more difficult whenever there is the experience of structural violence to identify the culprit, to identify the perpetrator. And so it's more invisible. It's less easy to discern why patterns of harm keep occurring to the same groups of people. Then this third part of the violence triangle, he calls cultural violence. And this is more or less the cultural, ideological, religious beliefs that sustain and legitimize direct and structural violence. So this might be sustaining direct and structural violence because we're taught through certain beliefs not to care about certain people. Violence in Sudan just happens. There will always be war in the Holy Land, in Palestine, Israel. You know, Black people are more prone to crime, like whatever it might be. And so there's all sorts of beliefs, whether it's through Hollywood, through political rhetoric, through family stories, that get normalized as part of the culture that we've inherited. So he discusses how these interact with one another. And in order to more effectively get at the root issues of violence and harm and polarization and everything that's happening, as peace builders, we need to develop more sensitivity to how people are experiencing violence in different ways. As one last comment before we move this into the theological realm, I have had some, usually it's people from a more legal background, just have a problem with this framework because they're like, no, no, violence is direct. Like we're misnaming these other two. And in some ways, I'm like, I think that's a legitimate claim. So I've also in many conversations heard this discussed as injustice. So structural violence as injustice, and then cultural violence as dehumanization or other similar practices. And so it's violence or direct violence, structural violence or injustice, and then cultural violence or dehumanization. And these things feed one another. So a number of years ago with a group of Christians, all of a sudden we started asking the question, I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, but we sometimes as a group will go through and think about different expressions of violence and which category they fall into. Well, let's pause there. As we think about some of these, like if we start in the top left, physical assault during a protest. What type of violence would that be? Feel free to also, write in the chat. But physical violence during a protest. So audibly, yeah, direct violence, Ronell, thank you. What about lack of access to quality healthcare in low-income neighborhoods? What kind of violence is that lack of access?
Injustice. Yeah, I was going to say I'm struggling between structural and cultural, but I see 3 votes.
Yes, great. That's great. Yeah, structural or injustice. So there's a lack of access, and so people are experiencing harm, experiencing struggle in different ways, and not getting, healthcare is a human right, and just certain people can't get it, and so they're experiencing that structural violence or that injustice as a result of their larger kind of situation, their community, and how it's disadvantaged. What about traditions that promote the idea that men are inherently superior to women, or that men should be leaders and women shouldn't be? What type of violence is that?
Gender violence.
Yeah, cultural violence. So again, these traditions, these cultural beliefs, they can come through religion, they can come through ideology, they can come through, political rhetoric and family stories and different things. We'll get them from a variety of sources, but it's ingrained this kind of belief that ultimately disadvantages and can deeply harm and can crush different groups of people because of how we've been taught to believe them. What about gender wage gap in various industries? Structural. I think maybe somebody put cultural before structural popped up. This is where, in some ways, people can get hung up about stuff. Like this would be structural because it is structural, but all of these are integrated. And so the structural violence exists because oftentimes of certain cultural beliefs, because of certain beliefs and cultural violence that sustain it. So they're related. But if we see something that manifests more, in the structure, the community, the group of people in terms of what they can experience, that's the structural violence. And then it's the attitudes, the beliefs that sustain it, that's the cultural violence, if that's making sense. In terms of reverse, that the structures can then reinforce certain beliefs. Absolutely. Absolutely. These things aren't, so even like whenever we thought about structural violence causing direct violence because people are so fed up with being disadvantaged, so they would lash out. The fact that then people are lashing out, angry at the system, kind of fighting back via protest or riot, whatever it might be, then will reinforce certain cultural beliefs, cultural violence about that group of people. So this is happening in every direction, mutually reinforcing one another. And especially in polarized societies, we see different narratives developing. A narrative would be another expression of potentially cultural violence, where we have a narrative that develops about a group of people based on structures or direct violence or whatever it might be. So these are not mutually exclusive. They're related to one another, and that's oftentimes where the confusion comes from. And I don't think, to me, what's less important isn't being able to parse out, wait, where's the line between this one and this one? Oftentimes it's clear once you kind of explore it further, but that's what matters less. What matters more is the fact that we start to see how there's an integrated whole to the experience of violence. It's not just the direct things that happen. It's also people being disadvantaged through structures, people being harmed or targeted through structures, people being taught to normalize certain types of things about entire groups of people. And so all of these are feeding a whole that creates more violence, more harm, and ultimately oftentimes more polarization as well. So let's move forward a little bit more. We can go through a lot of these. Of course, you're free to screenshot, think about this more, look up this violence triangle and examples of it, and there are many examples you can find. What I would love to do now is, I think, yes, let's apply this to our idea of sin. Because there was a workshop where I was going through this idea of the violence triangle, and all of a sudden the connections to how the Bible talks about sin became more apparent. They just seem to come alive. So I'd love to hear from you now. And again, feel free to jump in audibly. Feel free also to use the chat. But I'd love for you to reflect on some of these questions related to this sin triangle, reapplying this thinking to our understanding of sin. Yes, absolutely, Alicia. Thank you. But so if we have not just direct sin, which is more visible, oftentimes different, moral priorities that different religious groups of different kinds will have at times. But if we also think about this idea of structural sin, of structures being set up and that being framed as sin, of a cultural sin, how do we see this in the biblical narrative? How do we see this in the life of Jesus? I'd love to focus on that one first. What stories from Jesus's life, what biblical stories to broaden it out further? What does this triangle call to mind as you think about verses, stories from the Bible and from the life of Jesus?
The woman who is going to be stoned for adultery seems to me to be cultural sin, because what was the role of the men who were accusing her of this crime?
Yeah,
So to
thank
me,
you,
that's
Debbie.
cultural.
Well, it's interesting. I think even looking at that story, starting to think through, what cultural sin is at play in this story? What structural sin is at play in this story? What direct sin is at play in this story? And what is Jesus doing in the middle of all that? Any thoughts there? And yeah, great other examples, Lazarus, tax collector, woman at the well. But yeah, with the story of the woman caught in adultery and Jesus interrupting direct violence, what else is going on? How do we see structural, cultural, and direct sin at play?
I was thinking of the visible and invisible and how her sins seem visible, but Jesus calls out the invisible in that story. He just nails it, right? Let him who has no sin be the first one, because he knows that they're all sinners who are, that are standing around. It's just that their stuff is invisible.
Yeah,
Just
or less
then
visible. And I think that.
hierarchy.
Less.
Oh,
The
sorry, go ahead.
hierarchy too that's created in that story.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, whenever there's, I have the scrolling thing, I'm trying to change my view of the group so I can more easily see who speaks. So wait, was that you, Jill, that jumped in? I saw you're unmuted. Oh, thank you. No, that
Yep.
was
Yep, that was me.
fantastic. Yeah, so no, this hierarchy at play. So immediately there's a bunch of powerful men standing around a woman accused of direct sin. So there's hierarchy at play. But then back as well, to Debbie's point, what cultural sin is at play here that's reinforcing the narrative that this is justified? Yeah. Yeah. So there's direct sin of adultery. There's kind of structural sin here of like this power dynamic being set up and it's not being equally applied.
Yeah, because the man
Fantastic,
that she
Lisa.
committed adultery with isn't in the mix. Like, where's
Yeah.
he? You know what I'm saying? Like, they didn't drag him out. Like, where's he at?
Yes. Well, I feel like, I mean, even if we think of the woman at the well, like I love this story as well because people think of the woman of the well and the primary framework is like adulteress. You went from man to man. And it's like if you start to, I mean, think about cultural dynamics at play. So just kind of more history, cultural dynamics, but then you start to see things with a bigger lens. It shifts the narrative significantly. If there's other biblical scholars, feel free to jump in after me here. But it's like this woman wouldn't jump from man to man. Like that's not even possible. She was tossed out by man after man. The most likely scenario being she couldn't bear children or something to that effect. So the structural violence that she's experiencing because of this belief of the need to bear children results in her being repeatedly cast out until she's basically ostracized from the community and she's seen as worthless. And so the gender dynamics at play in terms of the structures of gender dynamics and then the cultural beliefs reinforcing those dynamics and then oftentimes the direct violence that can occur towards them. Yeah, Debbie, absolutely. So there's other dynamics where even like if you think about rape laws and other things, it gets the wheels turning. So again, with all of these stories, we're not going to solve it all now. And I'm trying to catch up on the chat here as well. Yes, Gillian, fantastic. As far as kind of the involvement of the society, of the community, and oftentimes creating structural contexts that are creating situations like this. That's fantastic. Yeah, the man involved, not included, conspicuous by his absence. Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things that has surfaced more recently as people have started discussing this sin triangle and how oftentimes these structural and cultural dynamics or sins are oftentimes less visible, they're more difficult to discern, is oftentimes how much and oftentimes Western Christianity has focused so much on the individual, on sort of an individualistic faith that we lack a radar to start to read power dynamics, structural dynamics. And power isn't just about structures, power is also about storytelling, who shapes the cultural narrative, who shapes the beliefs. So we basically lack a radar for a lot of what is under that dotted line that is in the invisible section. So it's a real blind spot because what happens whenever we start to see sin and God's priorities as primarily this direct sin? If that's like the problem statement of Christianity, that it's all about this direct sin, you become a gospel of sin management. It's all about managing sin, escaping from the guilt of your individual sin, and the reality of these larger dynamics. Like one person in one of these workshops brought up, it's like, oh my gosh, we are enslaved to sin. Whenever I've been taught that sin is primarily this direct stuff, being enslaved to sin, it's like, yeah, we all have a propensity to do some wrong things, but it kind of feels small and trite and almost silly. Not, again, not to downplay the complicity involved here, major complicity, but we can't even see it until we start to see sin is so much bigger. Like we were born into societies that are setting up structures and cultures of beliefs that are dehumanizing some and validating others, that are crushing some and elevating others. We were born into that, whether we were born on the bottom or on the top. And that has enslaved all of us. And oftentimes we're blind to it because we've been taught to focus on this smaller individual direct sin. But one last point, and I think this would probably surface in the conversation, or already kind of has, is there's with the cultural sin of the group, and the structure is set up to legitimize violence towards this woman caught in adultery. there is complicity. Like all of these, yes, generational sin. Bam. Like there's a whole nother factor here. And I think that might even relate to the next paradigm that we'll get into as well. But even generational sin and how we're born into cultures that have taught us certain ways. Thank you, Rachel. But direct sin, there's complicity here. This experience of violence by this woman, there's a culture that legitimated it, a structure that creates a context for it. And then there's a whole lot of people that then are about to be complicit in direct violence, and I would say direct sin, in the murder of this woman. And so this isn't to downplay or erase individual, moral, direct sin, but it creates a wider context for it rather than make it the whole. When it's the whole, then all of a sudden, even like thinking about salvation and God's work, it's like it becomes all about not being guilty for my direct sin. If sin is the problem, we got to get rid of sin, then try not to sin and sin management, that becomes the whole. But whenever the problem is so much bigger. The problem of sin is so enormous. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, the healing work, God's salvific work to heal, to transform, to liberate us from the systems that have enslaved us, in slavery to sin. Like this salvific work is so much bigger, so much more difficult than just managing individual sin. Yeah, Elisa, fantastic, as well as sin being considered communal. That in some ways, shrinking sin has made the gospel small. So any kind of closing comments related to this first paradigm, reflections about this diagram, other ways that light bulbs going off, questions, tensions that you see, and then we'll jump into paradigm 2.
I
Feel
just
free.
want to
Go ahead,
say
Debbie.
it's quite a challenge, isn't it, to try to look at something bigger than we've ever looked before. It really actually asks a lot of us, which I think is absolutely
Yeah,
about the complexity that, we are being called into.
yeah,
It's not just simple.
yeah. I think that's brilliant. In some ways, we've liked the gospel of sin management because it's easy. It's manageable. I can deal with my individual issues. I was about to use a 4-letter word. We can deal with that. It's manageable, at least in our kind of control-oriented, cultures, to say like, let's manage that individual sin. But to see something bigger, the problem is so much bigger, can be really daunting and intimidating. And yet we see it in the life of Jesus. We see it in the biblical narrative. We feel it in Jesus's call, the call of the Holy Spirit. And that calls us to something so much more. And yeah, so for those who need to duck out, I think the recording will be made available as well. But Leah, go ahead.
I knew you were ringing some bells, and I'm like, where have I heard this before? I read a book recently called Failing America's Faithful: How Today's Churches Are Mixing God with Politics and Losing Their Way. And this author, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, I think was making the same point you're making, which is we're focused on this personal sin. And I've even seen it in the mission statement of this new church I've started attending, which references a personal relationship with Jesus, which I'm not against. But the point this author was making is this focus on the individual has made people care less about other people, about the poor or whoever that is. And so,
Yeah.
anyway, I just wanted to mention that book. It's a little bit old and yet also very, very relevant to these times that we're living in my opinion.
What was the name of the book again?
Failing America's Faithful.
Failing America's Faithful. Thank you, Leah. No, that's a fantastic point. There is oftentimes, I think, if we start to see these bigger paradigms, we can see tendencies sometimes for people to stop recognizing how much like God wants us to heal and be whole. It's easy to sort of go from one extreme to another. And how do we hold all of this in tension? Just because structural and cultural sin is a thing doesn't mean that individual direct sin is no longer an issue. Like, it's like we are complicit in harm in all sorts of ways, conscious and unconscious. And so in the same way that it's like, yeah, Jesus' salvation is bigger than about you. Jesus also wants you to be whole, wants me to be whole. And so it's like all of this, it's bigger, and it doesn't mean to disregard some of those individual aspects, but it's beyond that. And yeah, thank you. The link is in the chat related to the book that you just mentioned, Leah, but fantastic point. Let's jump into the second paradigm. So this comes from EMU. We can provide a link afterwards. If you put in cycles of violence or cycles of harm, we also have, there are a variety of versions of this. This is a really more detailed, fantastic one. Feel free to screenshot if you'd like. We can provide links up to kind of the authors with star strategies for trauma awareness at EMU, or you can find it via their website. But I was doing a workshop on this, as I mentioned during the intro. And as we kind of looked at from kind of the middle, you start at kind of the event causing injury, harm, or trauma. It's like there's something that hurt. And then there's all these responses that it causes in our bodies. Physiological responses, shock, fear, denial, powerlessness, helplessness, crying, shaking, laughing, all the stuff you see at kind of the beginning of that victim survival cycle. But it also, oftentimes people that have been hurt, there isn't just this immediate move over to the perpetrator side. Sometimes there is, sometimes, that's a longer term process, but oftentimes we see all of this internal harm occurring, self-loathing. It's internally destructive because your sense of dignity has been violated. And because of that, there can be all sorts of struggles related to worth, related to value, related to all sorts of things. And so as we process that, but we also see how this can launch you because of the need for justice and safety and all of these core needs that we have, it can launch you onto this path of demonizing the other, which is human. This is human. We do that because, like, how could somebody commit so much harm to me? In some ways, we have to see them as, like, it's like psychologically easier to make sense of why they would hurt me if in some way they're just flawed, if they're not fully right. It's easier to make sense of why they would be so bad. So we start to dehumanize. We make these us versus them narratives. Ultimately, we can justify our own use of violence, whether it's direct or structural, individual or structural, in order to do harm to the other who's perceived as a threat, who in some way has, caused us harm or could cause us harm, all of that. So I think already there may be ways that, like, light bulbs could be going off if we think about the connection of this to sin, because whether it's ego and pride, whether it's self-loathing, whether it's violence, whether it's lying, whether it's, like whatever sorts of different things, there's so many ways that we see how that can connect, and I think pretty directly connects to these processes of this cycle of harm, this cycle of violence. So as different workshop participants had reflected about this, I started to think, like, let's create something just a bit simpler related to just like a sin cycle and kind of see what pops up. So I'd love to do the same thing as last time and just think about, how do we see this playing out biblically in the life of Jesus? How do we see verses about this? What does this bring up as we think about sin through not just this lens of the triangle, direct, structural, cultural, but we think about sin as cyclical? And I remember, I don't know whether it's Sung Chan Ra or some other voice that I'd read that all of a sudden had this framing of sinned against. And so certainly that relates to this experience of harm, experience of trauma, and all of the unhealed harm, unhealed trauma, unhealed injuries and wounds that create the conditions for self-harm and for further harm outward. But then we have, if we think about the connection to the last diagram, we have the cultural reinforcement. We develop allies that share our narrative and will reinforce it to develop a narrative against the other. And so this is true of all this. I like saying this in broad language because I see it in the Balkans where I live. I see it in the States where I'm from. See it in so many different societies, but it's also continually convicting that how many times I'm connecting with people, the reinforcement side, that see societal problems the way I do and just reinforce it. So I start to see people across whatever sorts of divisions as less worthy, as in some way inherently bad and harmful. So I'm caught in this cycle too. This isn't just what they do, it's what we do naturally. It's how sin sort of creates its own momentum. And then, of course, there is the individual sin. We become complicit in harm, whether it's towards ourselves, towards others, towards other groups. And in a way, then this builds up to that slavery of sin where we are caught in these cycles against one another, whether it's in a marriage, with a colleague, or with the other group in society, or another country and war and justifying violence towards them because of our narratives that we believe about how it's legitimate. So what comes up biblically, what comes up in the life of Jesus or the broader biblical narrative, what does this connect for you? Feel free to use the chat or jump in by voice.
Well, the first thing that came to mind for me, oh, let's see if it's the same person, is Judas's betrayal of Jesus, maybe.
Wait, talk about that a bit more.
Well, and maybe it's just a question like, I don't know what compelled him to do that, right? Was it greed? Was it the devil? Who knows what it is? But the truth, he followed Jesus, betrayed Jesus, got the money. It seems like regretted it, tried to give it back, and they're like, nope, what's done is done. And then he went and killed himself. So it's a
Why did it play out that way? Yeah.
I don't know.
It's interesting because Judas is a fascinating character because he was a zealot. He's ready to fight the Romans. You think about the framework of Jesus being king. So Judas has experienced injury in some way at the top here. He has been harmed by the Roman occupation. He's been sinned against. And all of a sudden, he encounters this Messiah who has power over nature, healing, all of this. There's a great book. Oh my gosh, what is it called? I'll find it later, but it basically is going through maybe someone will know it after I describe it, but it's basically going through Holy Week, more through the lens of how Jesus is engaging in peace building. And he shares in this book, references a variety of scholars that are like normally during Passover. So whenever Jesus is coming in, the Romans would come from Caesarea by the sea to Jerusalem because there's always religious unrest. Passover is about liberation from Egypt. People want to be liberated from Rome. It's going to be messy. So there'd always be a triumphal entry. Now you see where this is going, perhaps. And literally, like Pilate, war horses, all of the shining equipment. People see this coming in, and this is their occupier whom they hate. And Jesus comes in, probably directly from the other side of the city, on a donkey, on a peacetime animal. Whenever people, the Gospel of John talks about how people went not just to see Jesus, but to see Lazarus, whom he just raised from the dead. So there's this powerful messianic figure, all of the expectations that he is this powerhouse that can finally liberate them from Rome. Not only that, palm branches. Palm branches come from the Maccabean rebellion, maybe even earlier, as a symbol of Jewish nationalism against their occupiers. So this wasn't an innocent gathering just praising Jesus. This is a nationalistic gathering, to put it mildly. Maybe it could have been seen as protest. It could have been, but it's clearly the Romans are paying attention here. So you think about all of a sudden this reinforcement of this narrative. Judas is connected to this group that sees what the Romans have done, how evil they are. And here's this guy who has conquered even death and raised Lazarus from death. They might have all these spears and swords and shields, but we have Jesus who can raise them from the dead. What can they do? So in some ways, there seems to me this possibility of we, with Jesus on our side, if we finally just push things over the edge, Jesus wouldn't let them kill him. He's finally going to stand up, and all of this energy around him, we can kick out the Romans, and he makes it happen. He supports it to allow it to happen. He heals people that are hurt, all of this. There easily, I think, would be a narrative there. I think it's very justified. Whether it's true, I think you have to get into, maybe some of you would even know, like, whatever biblical scholarship, but there's a lot of scholarship behind. There's a lot more going on in Holy Week related to cycles of violence, cycles of sin here, and Jesus rejecting it in a way that was very unexpected for his own co-religionists, if you will, for the Jewish population, and ultimately, yeah, played out like it did. And so that's one of the things with Judas that comes to mind related to this cycle, that all of a sudden there's an entrenched pattern that he's participating in because of his hatred of the Romans. Other thoughts related to biblical narratives, building on that, other ideas about how this connects with our biblical understanding.
It really reminds me of the passage where Jesus is talking about eating, and he's like, it's not what you put in that makes you clean. It's actually what comes out of you that makes you unclean. And so I think sometimes, like, in the cycle of being victimized or traumatized, like, you actually, like, whatever was done to you is the thing that makes you, like, you can believe that that's the thing that makes you unclean. And then you can
Yeah.
buy into that narrative in a variety of ways, either justify it by by self-harm, or
Yeah.
like but it's like the thing that comes out of you, what you're like agreeing with, what you're like, you know what I'm saying? It's not what's done to you, but it's like the way that you're oriented towards that thing, that, like, what it's producing in you, that's then coming out of you, that then is like the thing that, like, contributes harm. That's like what it means.
I love that reapplication. That, I mean, I think clearly people really interpreted that passage as related to food, and I think appropriately. But I think to actually go deeper than that, that there's a larger principle that I think is also biblically, psychologically true. And I think even with how much harm creates this dynamic that you're talking about in terms of self-harm, self-loathing, all of that. And it's like, how do we actually, that harm, that event didn't actually make you worthless. Like, but so many times we believe that when we've been hurt, there's all those struggles. And it's really, how are we responding? How are we, breaking that cycle, reinforcing that understanding of our own worth and value as children of God, and then able to sort of break it and respond what comes out of us, as you're saying, to be different. I love that. Thank you, Alicia. Others, other thoughts, building on that, or other ideas related to this cycle and how we see that biblically in the life of Jesus play out even in society, other things.
I think the turning the other cheek is very important, in that that helps to break that cycle, that Jesus didn't do what everybody was hoping he would do, and I can understand why. But
Yeah.
about turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, and again, that all has a Roman connotation apparently, because I can't remember exactly now, other people might, but if you were, sometimes you had to go a mile, but then you'd go an extra mile. There was something about what the legionnaires did and all that. So it's obviously in a context that is very dusty for us, because again, culturally, there's so much we don't understand. But in that context, Jesus is trying to break, it's a circuit breaker, I see it, and that it's love, and the last thing we want to do is love our enemies, and we're going, no way, man, but it's the only way, because God loves us regardless, and we are being godlike in doing so, and that's who Jesus represents on earth, isn't it? A different way of being human, really. That's it, really. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you, June. I love that. Even, like, I love the language of, like, a circuit breaker. Like, I haven't heard it phrased in that way. I love that. It's a different way to kind of see that interruption of, there's a pattern here, there's a lot of energy here, and then, like, boom, it kind of changes the energy, disrupts the energy that's flowing in the wrong direction. And yeah, for those that are interested in what June's talking about, Walter Wink did fantastic work related to I think, a really fantastic contextual understanding of what does turn the other cheek mean, what does go the extra mile, giving your cloak as well mean in the context that Jesus was talking about as really one of nonviolent active resistance. And so I think that is a perfect example of how Jesus is both interrupting this process as a circuit breaker, as you put it, but then also really providing some direction, creative vision for what could it look like to actually go beyond that and try to undo this cycle, to try to heal some of these wounds and begin to intervene actively. So that's fantastic. Thank you, June. Yeah, I definitely agree with some of the comments in the chat related to the large scale ways that we see this playing out. And I think that's where I love that cycles of violence kind of infinity diagram. In some ways, it's almost too much information. But actually psychologically and kind of how we see these internal processes playing out, it's really well done. So I'd encourage take a look at that further if you're interested. This diagram in some ways is trying to simplify that, which we see on that grand scale and kind of different conflicts around the world. Conflicts sometimes not being the right word, but to see this sort of through a theological lens of how sin is doing the same thing. It isn't just a cycle of harm, victimization. It's a cycle of how we're caught in systems of sin, in cultures of sin, and in complicity with sin. Any other thoughts, comments? If there's a pause, then we'll go into the third paradigm, and then we can kind of connect some of these as well as we close after like another half an hour. Well, fantastic. Let's jump into the third one. So yeah, we've already talked about sin as a triangle and how we see that there's this kind of more invisible. It doesn't mean it is invisible, but oftentimes we aren't as attentive to it. These structural and cultural sins, not just individual direct sin, and to be attentive to that whole. Also see how sin becomes this self-destructive kind of spiral that sucks us in. However good-hearted we are, how much we get caught in this in terms of dehumanizing others, in terms of complicity in all of these patterns. So building on that, in terms of the third paradigm and thinking about this sin, death, powers matrix, I want to reference Richard Beck's book called The Slavery of Death. So feel free to jot that down, take note of that. But in it, to provide a little bit of a summary, which I'd already started at the very beginning, he talks about our Western Protestant focus on Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death. And so really here we see sin is the primary thing, the main problem, and it's leading to death. And we see this primarily in the creation narrative, Adam and Eve. And so this is where the idea of original sin comes from. And this prioritization of sin as the primary problem lends itself most naturally, most intuitively towards that gospel of sin management, because sin is the main problem. We have to deal with sin. So it reshapes our understanding of what is the Christian life about. It's managing sin. What is salvation, atonement, the cross about? It's about freeing us from the guilt of sin. And so just this view of sin as the primary thing and this focus on this verse as the main way to understand sin frames us, not entirely, but I think intuitively it pushes people towards this kind of sin framing in what God is most trying to deal with. So what Richard Beck then talks about is how the Orthodox formulation, it isn't as simple as what I'm showing here. In a lot of ways, it's that matrix of sin and death and the powers all wrapped up together. But he first shares about this emphasis on this verse from 1 Corinthians 15. The sting of death is sin. So what does sting mean? Like the poisonous outcome of death is sin. So in this verse, that prioritization is flipped. Death in this verse is causing sin. It's a poisonous outcome. Sin is a poisonous outcome of death. So instead then, if this is the priority, if this is what we want to be focusing on, then the focus shifts from just trying to deal with sin as the main thing that's problematic with God in our faith. It shifts it to say, okay, wait, death and the fear of death are the main thing. Dealing with healing us from the grip that death has caused. So it's interesting because he goes into a lot of the church fathers in providing more of a justification. We can start to see different patterns in the biblical narrative about kind of what is the main issue at play here. Is it sin or is it death? And he describes how oftentimes it isn't just this one prioritization over the other in the historic Orthodox formulation, but he's talking about how it's more this complex interplay. Certainly in the creation account, the Orthodox theologians would oftentimes call not sin original sin, but they would call it ancestral sin. So it would be more or less an account of why is death in the world. Sin invited death and decay into the world. So this is where death came from. The point isn't necessarily about primacy, about sin is the main issue, but it's about why is the world so broken? If God is good, why is death and decay even here? And it's because of sin, in that ancestral sin formulation. That sin allowed death to enter the world. But in terms of what our primary context is, in terms of the primary issues that govern our lives, death is at the root of so much sin, of so much fear, of so many cycles of violence, of domination, of so many, even gets into kind of this neurotic, this kind of this fear of death in Western societies that isn't necessarily about survival. It's about one's legacy. So it's driving ego. The fear of death is driving ego, that your work, your legacy, your life, that it carries on beyond death, that we defeat death even in our legacy kind of thinking. And so that actually it's this, and so Richard Beck is a psychologist by background. So he's sharing much more about how death is at the root of so many sins, processes of sin, cycles of sin, all the ways we see sin manifesting in the world and harming relationships, destroying people, destroying societies, individuals, everyone. The fear of death is oftentimes this root driver because we're trying to acquire more money and more power so we are secure, even at the expense of our neighbor. We're investing so much in our work at the expense of our family, at the expense of these other relationships, because we want our legacy to carry on. So the fear of death is this major driver in cycles of sin. So instead of there being this simple, sin is the root issue and it causes death, or death is the root issue and it causes sin, oftentimes the Orthodox formulation is more complex, that these are interacting with one another. And then you get even in this idea of the Satan or the powers, and how temptation and so many other like biblical frameworks related to the enemy and even the principalities and powers and all of the language along those lines. These powers, however we understand them, both even in the political realm, ideologies, all these other things, as well as spiritually in terms of the spiritual weight, the spiritual power behind these systems, and whether or not we envision however we envision the Satan and the spirituality in the spiritual world. And there's a lot of ways people envision that with subtle differences. But in some way, the powers are reinforcing this dynamic of fear of death, the acquisition of power in order to dominate, and cycles of sin in order to stay safe, to get back at the other, for one's own legacy, everything else. So there's this matrix of interacting ideas between sin, death, and the powers that are at play, and not just sin is the main issue. Yeah. So last slide here and then I want to open it up for conversation related to how these frameworks interact and kind of influence our priorities as Christians, as people of faith. But I wanted to basically bring those two other paradigms back into, onto the screen, and then also bring out more forcefully, because of this idea from Richard Beck about how death and the fear of death. And there's that, what is the verse in Hebrews? Does somebody have it off the top of their head? About he who holds, here, one moment.
Is it 2:14 and 15?
Yes, that's absolutely it. It's just pulling it up on my screen. So since
Inasmuch oh, go ahead.
please, no, you go ahead.
Inasmuch therefore as the children have blood and flesh in common, he too shared in these same things, so that by death he might render the one holding the power of death, that is the slanderer, ineffectual, and might liberate those who had all their lives been bound in slavery by their fear of death.
Yes. So again, just a second reading of especially that end point, so that Jesus' death, by his death, he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil or the slanderer, as Jill read, and free those, us, who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Then we even start to think about, for me, reflecting on this, how much Jesus is just saying, do not be afraid. How much the conquest of death, the end of death, Jesus, the atonement, the cross, the resurrection, Jesus' words related to just fear. All of a sudden, there's a different kind of significance to those things, because in some ways, Jesus, by his death and resurrection, confronting these cycles of sin, confronting structural, cultural sins and complicity in it, is then cast into death and then conquests our last fear, that fear of death. It shifts kind of the nature of what Jesus's liberation can mean for us, what the cross can mean for us. So on this slide, I wanted to put that visualization of death, fear of death, as in some ways this background power, this background fear that is holding us in the grips of these sin triangles and these cycles of sin. So I'd love to open it up there. Again, other reflections related to any one of these three. Maybe first, let's have an emphasis on this third idea of inverting. What is is it actually death and the fear of death? That's the priority. And how much that's actually more central in some ways to what God is wanting to liberate us from than just sin. How much sin is actually a byproduct of that fear. Feel free to bring up thoughts, verses, stories from the Bible about that, or to connect that to these other two frameworks. So I'd love to open it up there for now, for thoughts, reflections, tension, other ideas that are surfacing for you.
So you're saying that sin is expressed death anxiety.
Yes. Sin, let's say that again. Sin is expressed death anxiety.
Death anxiety.
So our death anxiety expressed is sin. I think that's a very concise way of putting it. And again, that's not necessarily the whole story, but I think it might be a lot more central to the story than many Western Christians who have had this framework of sin is the main thing, rather than fear of death and death anxiety and death being the main thing, so we can be freed from these cycles and triangles, matrices of sin and violence and harm. Other thoughts, stories, verses, questions.
Well, it just reminds me of my work related to gun violence prevention, and that's like a complicated issue, right? And I always tell people to follow the money and who benefits by keeping us afraid, right? So full disclosure, I'm not a gun owner, but there are people who feel like they need a gun to protect themselves, even though there's research that if you own a gun, you're more likely to die by gun violence, right? So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a perfect example. That
yeah.
like integrates all three of these different things in one simple story related to your work. So there's fear involved that's driving this need to self-protect, that's through the potential use of violence and threat, that then can all of a sudden, so it's reinforcing these sort of structures and cultures that legitimate lots of guns. And then it actually can feed into the experience of harm by gun violence, death by gun violence because of being a gun owner, and that how that actually what's the right word? It amplifies the threat in situations of potential violence, and all of a sudden people get shot more quickly. So yeah, the likelihood of being killed if you're a gun owner. I've read this similar research. So no, that's connecting in some different subtle ways all three of these. That's a really great example. Thank you, Leah.
There's so much. There's so much here, you know? The like as a linguist, I am not sure. And anyway, if the sting of death is sin and the wages of sin is death, then there are ways in which there are ways of making those sentences compound. So the wages of the sting of death, okay? That's like if you take I'll and so the sting of the wages of sin, okay? So like death is the sting of the wages of sin, and the wages of the sting of death is sin. So there are these ways in which these two sentences, like I feel like it's kind of like, if you're Eastern Orthodox or to the Western side, and which one do you believe the Holy Spirit came, is it one, did one proceed from the other, or I'm like,
Yep.
actually both of those things can be true at the same time. And
Yes.
so, and specifically talking about like the powers and the idea of a wage of sin, like this idea of labor and enslavement. And actually, like when you are enslaved, you like, I don't care. You can't liberate yourself. Like, actually, like that is a part of the issue, is that you cannot liberate yourself from a condition of slavery. Actually, it's usually always an external liberation from that experience. And so I think it's like really interesting to think about why then, what does deliverance mean? And what does it mean in a communal context if we're like caught up in this like enslavement to the fear of death?
Yeah.
And then that makes me think of, lastly, Ephesians 2, which it talks about you were dead in your sins, like you were dead in your sins. So there is this relationship between death and sin. And it talks about the flesh, the world, and the prince of the air, where are these three kind of parts. And it made me think of the first system, or the first kind of model, where you have the invisible, like direct sin being related to the flesh, the structural sin being related to like the world and like the world systems, and then like the cultural being like related to the prince of the air, or the lies and the temptations that we're meant to believe. And all of these three things in Ephesians 2 working together to actually like we're dead and then we're raised to life. We're not like bad and made good. We're like dead and then we're delivered. So that's what all that made me think of.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think definitely at a certain point to parse things out of like, wait, which is the priority. In some ways, it's interesting to think about. I think in some ways, to dethrone our obsession with oftentimes individual sin, to me, is more the point. There's a more complex matrix involved here in which individual sins are caught in a larger matrix of power dynamics and cultural and structural violence and cycles of sin and lies and the powers and what we think we need to do to experience life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness or whatever. And so it's like this kind of triangle to me is a better representation than just saying out with that, sin leads to death and in with death leads to sin. It's like, no. there's more going on here. So I really love you emphasizing that as like there's a lot of dynamics here and ways it connects to different things. Um, I also, just to name Usama, I really love all of my intuitions are right there with you too, in terms of like God's primary response to sin is healing, liberation, all of that, not using it as a bludgeon about individuals and their guilt. And so I think that, in terms of starting to see sin as a bigger thing and how there's much more work to heal and to liberate from, I think is the goal of what I'm really hoping that people can see here. I think one of the things that's a slight point of tension with what you're saying, which I think you'd probably agree with too, is that it's not just this soft kind of healing. There is a level of confrontation in it, but it's primarily with the powers, with those that are complicit with the structural and cultural violence at play. And so there is a level of confrontation against those that are accelerating and complicit in this cycle of sin, in dominating others, in creating those structures and cultures. But when, other than the Pharisees and other leaders, did Jesus ever condemn or in some way like confront in a more confrontational way anyone that is more at the bottom, any of the marginalized, the oppressed, the hurting, all of those? In some ways it seems like, man, he's really light on those sort of more individual sins, and yet those oftentimes have become the priority of Christianity at large. So I'm fully with you about there's a healing response here, but part of it is confrontation with the powers. So it's not just a soft thing. It requires more. So let's see. To move towards the end, I don't know if I'd love, sometimes if there's the right group size, other things. I love doing like 1-2 group reflections, like you reflect individually, then you reflect with a pair, and then you share a reflection with the group. Because of just time and everything that way, I just would rather open it up for a kind of final few comments. If people have any other insights, questions. Again, this isn't meant to answer everything related to sin, but I think my goal here is to say, if we look at these frameworks, like a lot of this is very directly related to peace building work. And so it's like, how are we interrupting cycles of sin? How are we interrupting cycles of violence that are called to confront sin, to combat sin, to heal the effects of sin, to liberate people from being enslaved to sin? As we follow Jesus in all of this work, it's a call to deal with not just this individual small thing of individual complicity and individual kind of direct sins, but it's a much bigger picture. It calls us into the work of peace building, of healing everything, of confronting systems of harm and violence and injustice, to breaking these cycles of harm, whether it's in a marriage, with a colleague, in our polarized communities, in the world. So my hope is that these frameworks for sin would compel you more to see peace building as central to our call as we're following Jesus in this work to heal all of the impact, the enslavement that we have experienced to sin, to these cycles and processes. So any comments there before we move to a close, and then I'll share a few closing things in the last 2 or 3 minutes. But any final comments, questions, thoughts?
Brian, I really liked how you compare the triangle and the cycle, and how you put it from those other pieces into making it something that we could hooks that we can hang things on and articulate it. I think probably most of us are already thinking this way, but to have it articulated so well and concisely, it's really, really great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I can, so we can go back to this, but also I think it's here. If you want this slideshow, just do the QR code. I can also share it with you later, but then you can feel free to think about these frameworks and how you can reapply them. Because like, I love to share stuff and say like, how can you build on it? Like, how can you circle back and be like, hey, there's something that might have been missed here, another connection that would be really important. But these are things I think that would be of use in congregations, because I think the biblical stories are clear. The ways that it all of a sudden makes for a more robust and holistic faith, I think are exciting to me. So I hope that it can be helpful in that way to you as well. Yeah, thank you, Osama, again. And I feel like in some ways, whenever I talk about this with non-Westerners, It's interesting because I've talked to many Christians, whether it's in Africa, in kind of Eastern Europe, some Palestinians. I recently talked to a Palestinian friend and colleague about some of these sin dynamics. And he was just like, oh my gosh, we've been taught Western ideas of individualistic sin that don't even fit with our view of the world. But we've believed it. Like many people have believed it because that's what like the missionaries taught. And so it has made the faith small rather than the impact of sin huge and something that God cares about all of it. So I feel like I would hope that in some ways some of these frameworks would more intuitively fit with the natural ways that people see their faith and live it out, but also provide frameworks to more easily spread them, because the impact of an individualistic kind of small view, kind of Western view of what Christian faith should be, I think has done damage in a lot of places that have had a more holistic posture, approach, and theology, but have been taught that it's not right. So I hope it would connect in that way.
Yeah.
Others.
Well, I think for me, this is just reminding me of something I'm sure I saw on social media, but it was talking about how systems are made up of people. So particularly at this moment in time, we talk about the justice system when we should be talking about judges or justices, or we talk about Congress and we should be talking about senators or Congress people. And I think so it's maybe just a yes and thought that like, what can we do individually and how can we influence systems that we are a part of?
Yes. I really appreciate you naming that, because in some ways this can start to make us feel overwhelmed about the scope and we feel too small to respond. So I think what you said, Leah, is a brilliant emphasis to kind of say we don't have to do all of this. Like, we're part of a larger community. And if this is still so much of my hope for the church, is if the church would actually catch a glimpse of what Jesus is about all the ways that Jesus wanted to heal all of us, then the church can be just a powerful force for transformation, positive transformation in so many societies, because it carries so much cultural weight in how it's forming people around the world. And so how are we as part of a community able to invite our community into this work? It's not about us as individuals, because that is daunting and overwhelming and will depress you very quickly. But just as sin isn't just about your individuals, the calling to respond to this is also about the collective. It's about all of us. Well, let's move into the close here for the last just couple minutes. So again, there's the slideshow here. If anyone would like access to this, you can follow up with me. But just to emphasize about Peace Catalyst then again, and just invite you into more ways to connect with us, partner with us. Peace Catalyst is about both equipping and mobilizing. Those are both key words in our organizational mission statement. And so equipping is about stuff like this, about how do we connect with communities and provide resources to actually skill up, to actually do better reflection theologically, to start to integrate ourselves with God's peace building work more fully, that we would be equipped for it. That frankly, it's about discipleship, because if Christians are called to follow Jesus and Jesus' mission is to heal everything, holistic and just peace, Jesus' mission is peace building, then how are we actually discipling the church to join in Jesus's work? So it's about that equipping, but it's also about mobilizing. How do we start to get involved? And we're still trying to get better at that. There's so many organizations doing very similar work, so we don't want to organizationally be selfish in any way about this. It's about the larger work that we can participate in. And my hope would be you could have organizations and others that you can connect to locally in your own area, your own geography, your own country, community, because it takes, as we were just discussing, it takes the collective. And so how can we help network with you and for you to help join in the good local work that's happening? And sometimes that's not with local Christians. Sometimes it might be with non-religious groups or with Muslims or whoever else. Many of our team members have our primary local partnerships are not with the churches or with Christians because many of them aren't interested in the work. So we're working with those who are doing it, and we're trying to model it and get involved with it, and then invite Christians in. So how can we help you get equipped to join in the local work? And there's ways you can do that with Peace Catalyst that you see that here. Also, you're not just invited to get involved in terms of practical work. Especially for me, living in Sarajevo internationally, I'm having the privilege to work with more and more peace builders from communities of struggle. They don't have access to Western networks. They have a much more difficult job to put food on the table, and to continue to do meaningful local work. It is a calling and a passion, even whenever they can barely kind of keep things going at times. And so to partner with Peace Catalyst in our just general Waging Peace Fund is also, a portion of that is always going into our equity fund to help empower and support these peace builders from around the world, whether it's like a colleague of mine here in Bosnia. Here I have a few examples for you, but we have like Mirella Popaya Hadjic, who's doing a lot of trauma work. She's a Gestalt psychotherapist and trauma sensitivity, trauma healing trainer, as well as doing therapeutic work. And we have Salim Anfous, who works with the Across the Divide podcast, a partner of Peace Catalyst in Palestine, and their team members are dispersed a bit, but it's Palestinian voices and related to the struggle against apartheid injustice, even genocide at this point in history, that they have been experiencing, and Christians that have been living and working there and living out the faith there as a witness. The level of nonviolence and like, I mean, Osama here on the call and others, like there's so much deep passion for and investment in how do we live out our faith nonviolently as a witness to a different and better way. And Palestinians are some of the most vibrant community in that regard. We also have Philip Kakungulu, who's doing a lot of organizing work, peace building mobilization in Africa, some contexts that are also combating the rise of Christian nationalism, and some of them even whenever there's the Christian Muslim division in different places in Africa, religiously motivated violence or polarization, other things. And then Moses Abaladi is our newest team member, and he's in Abuja, Nigeria, does a lot with peace education in schools and other things. So you're always invited, whether it's through our equity fund and connecting with Peace Catalyst, whether it's to individuals, whether it's your own work and connecting and saying, how can I volunteer? How can I amplify different peace building work and voices that are going on around the world? How can I train up myself? How can I get my church involved? We are passionate about all of that and invite you deeper into the work.